Energy has a source. It comes from some place. It could be the sun, could be a generator, a power plant, a battery. But there's a source of energy. And we know that energy always travels the path of least resistance. So it's always going to go to the place that is most opposite its charge, most opposite its nature. So if we have a positive charge, it's going to head towards a place that is the least positive, or what we call negative. If there's high pressure, high pressure is going to move into where there's low pressure. Heat will always move into where it's colder. This is the second law of thermodynamics, which simply states that heat will always move from hotter objects to colder objects, or downhill, as it were, unless some other form of energy is supplied to change the direction. And that is the equivalent of Newton's first law of motion, which says that a body at rest or uniform motion will continue to be at rest or uniform motion until and unless some external force acts on it. Both of these laws make it very clear that energy is always going to take the most efficient path, the path that requires the least amount of dispersion of energy. It's going to always try to conserve its energy whenever possible. Hence, always will go down the path of least resistance. Interesting little side note, the law of thermodynamics isn't technically a law. It is a observed phenomena. Theoretically, a cup of room temperature water could divide itself into two parts. One side of the cup, the water is boiling, and on the other side of the cup, the water is frozen. It's just insanely unlikely that will happen. It would be equivalent to flipping a coin 1,000,000 times and having them come up heads each time. Very unlikely, but theoretically possible. It's kind of similar to how the field of an electron extends to the very end of the universe. So all of the electrons in your body, which is about 10 to the power of 28, that's a lot, have fields that extend to the very end of the universe. It's just that the field strength is so small that for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist. But in theory, it does. Just keep adding more and more zeros behind the decimal point. And as there's no such thing as an infinite number of zeros, in theory, there is some element of all of the fields of all of the electrons that make up your body at the very edge of reality, at the unfolding edges of the universe. In any case, without getting too distracted, energy moves from uphill to downhill, quote unquote, right? From high pressure to low pressure, from hotter to colder. The areas that are more uphill or higher pressure or more energized, we call the source, right? Because that's where the energy comes from. And where it's going to is the destination. Now, typically with our normal application of electricity, we would call one side positive and the other side negative. Or we can talk in the terms of a circuit. For example, the energy comes from a power plant of some kind, and that's the source, and it travels through the wires and goes through your home and lights your bulbs, and then it goes back to the energy plant. So in that example, the energy plant is both the source and the destination, and it goes in, it's like a closed loop. In the case of nature, for example, lightning, in the traditional thinking, you've got a big charge up in the sky, in the clouds, and it moves to the ground. All the electrons move down to the earth because there's an abundance of them above. But it can also work the opposite. There can actually be more electrons in the earth and less in the sky, and the lightning can move up from the earth into the sky. The point being is there is an imbalance in charge, and the energy will move always along the path of least resistance in order to create a balance. That is the only thing energy does. It moves only to balance itself. Because energy, which doesn't want to move, apparently, that's why it always travels the path of least resistance. It always attempts to conserve itself, but it has to move because there's an imbalance. Energy only moves to seek balance. That is the fundamental formula of all of reality. The only reason anything in the world, anything in existence exists is because energy is seeking balance. And according to, a number of the theories about the life of the universe, in the end, when entropy wins and energy has become completely balanced and doesn't need to move in order to seek balance, to create a balance, there's really nothing left in the universe except quantum dust. At least that is what some of the theories about the life of the universe proclaim. There's others that are very different, but none of them break the law that energy always moves the path of least resistance in an attempt to create a balance where there's an imbalance. So that sounds a little bit like a paradox, because earlier it was stated that energy will always conserve itself. It will always attempt to expend the least amount of energy. So how then does the universe end up with all of the energy dispersed? And the reason is because the only state where energy doesn't need to disperse itself is where all of the energy is balanced. So energy will disperse itself in order to create balance. And by the conservation of energy, that means that the energy will always seek the lowest level of sustainability that it can. And to do that, it has to disperse the higher levels of energy in order to achieve a lower stable level of energy. So in order for the energy to not expend any extra energy, it has to expend all of its energy. And in this case, we're talking about the energy being the movement of energy between an imbalanced state. So all of reality is a function of energy moving from point A to point B. If there was nothing for the energy to interact with, if it traveled completely unimpeded, well, then we wouldn't even see it. The reason we do see it is because something impedes it, and that impedance, that resistance, blocks or slows down that movement of energy. Now, in the material reality that we live in, that movement of energy moves at the speed of light. And I have a little video on, is the speed of light actually a constant? Which is interesting. You might want to check out. When something gets in the way of that movement by blocking it or slowing it down, there is a dispersion of energy. And this makes sense because here you have energy traveling at the speed of light, and it hits a dust particle, for example, or it hits a rock, or it's a plant. Well, there's a lot of energy that just got stopped. But energy isn't just going to stop at that point. The energy that is interacting with whatever is blocking it is going to create some sort of a reaction, a transformative reaction, because energy can't be just stopped or destroyed. It can only be transformed. So, for example, when that energy hits matter, the matter gets excited and consequently emits photons. And that's where light comes from. When that energy hits a plant, the plant absorbs some of that energy, which it uses for its own photosynthesis, etc., and the rest gets reflected. And of course, that absorbed energy that the plant collects is what created petroleum, which the modern world is now releasing. We, as humans, or as living things, all things that are living, act in the same way. We are a stopping point along the route of energy. similar to a light bulb, for example. The energy travels down the line, it hits resistance, which is the light bulb, and as a result, it creates light. The energy is traveling down the line, it hits us, a living organism. And what do we need to do? We need to do the same thing that the light bulb did, that the tungsten did, or the electron did. We need to dissipate that energy. That dissipation is what causes order, which is a consequence of the movement of energy in the most efficient way that energy can move, because we know that energy only moves the path of least resistance, only moves in ways that are the most conservative. So as energy becomes dissipated, it creates these patterns of order, or more accurately, these patterns of efficiency. Because how the energy moves will always be the most efficient way that it can move. This is the foundation of why nature and physics and the natural order of the universe is the way it is. Because those were the patterns and the paths and the order that was created by the dissipation of energy. And that order is also what accounts for evolution. The entire way that we have evolved is for the distribution of energy, but not just energy from the sun. We're talking about a different kind, or a different classification of energy. I don't want to say a different kind, because energy is energy, but it instantiates differently in different contexts. So we're talking about a different instance of energy that forces us to find new ways, organically, naturally, through evolution, find new ways to distribute this energy. And that is what we do. And that distribution comes in the form of ideas, thinking, concepts, beliefs, these mental structures that we create, the ability to plan things. The purpose of these is for the distribution of energy. In the case where we wire our house to have light, the point of that electricity is to make light. The energy hits the resistance. That resistance causes light, and then it goes on its way. But the point of all of the wiring is to create light. It's similar with us. We are a point of resistance. When the energy interacts with us, we slow it down because we're a blockage. We're a form of resistance to the energy that is moving through us. Consequently, we will emit something. We can say light metaphorically, but what we emit is actually something that's the equivalent of light, but we can't see it. It's that other form of energy. It's ideas and thoughts and beliefs and visions, the visions of a possibility. And we can do this because of self-awareness, which is itself a form of this light that we can't see, which is a consequence of the transformation of this energy that we are acting as a resistance to. So we are like the light bulbs of reality. Living things are like the light bulbs of reality. Consciousness, as we currently understand it, is metaphorically that light bulb, that light. Consciousness is an instance of awareness, and awareness is energy. At least that is the Thelonic claim. And that holds true when we look at it from this perspective. One small side note is that this ascending order, from the beginning of the chaos of the creation of the universe to the order that we have today, is temporary. Order is a particular state of chaos. And at some point, the order begins to disintegrate, and that also is a form of energy distribution. And that's why the universe will end up in a big chaotic mess of quantum dust. But at this moment in our existence, order is ascending. There's a chapter in the book, in Thelonia, The Mechanics of Existential Awareness, that attempts to figure out where on this curve of ascending and descending order we are. We're close to the top, but there's still quite a few millennia ahead of us before things begin to disintegrate back into chaos, at least on the universal scale. We see this all the time with just things, right, which deteriorate over time. So it's reasonable to presume that those are just micro versions of the macro reality that will eventually decay and disintegrate over time. In the grand spectrum of existence, which includes many different instances of reality, many different dimensions and various planes, or however you want to think about it, the physical world, which is the most resistive to this energy, is consequently the one that emits the most light, I guess you would say. Now, this sounds really contrary to what we would normally think of as the physical world, as opposed to the quote-unquote celestial or heavenly worlds, which we can only imagine are full of light, although that's not completely true. There are very dark worlds beyond the physical as well. But it is this tremendous resistance that we have to constantly support that allows for some incredibly bright bulbs, some incredibly bright points of light in the resistance or darkness or density of this material reality. That, and given that the material realm is the final context in which energy can instantiate throughout all of the different levels, the material world is the end point. It's the ground, as it were. That makes our material instance something that is extremely special and unlike our non-material existence, which, of course, we do live within. Right? Our physical instance is a small instance or a narrow instance of our greater reality. But it is what we do here in this physical world that is an expression of our greater existence within the limitations and restrictions and resistance of the scope and context of the physical reality we happen to find ourselves in at the moment. As a metaphorical example, there might be a nuclear power plant generating, gigawatts of energy, but the only way you are using it is for the single light bulb that is hanging in your room. That light bulb, for you, in your reality at that moment, is the only expression of that nuclear power plant and all of the energy that it is producing. So while the light bulb may seem insignificant, it is connected to a tremendous source of power. Our physical instances are similar to that light bulb. Not just our physical instances, that of all things, rocks, planets, insects, whatever. Anything that exists is similar to a light bulb, or anything else that is an expression of energy as a result of energy moving through that resistance. And consequently, that resistance is distributing that energy, as that's what it has to do, resulting in expressions in this material world. So, of course, this applies to forms, plants, people, whatever, but it also applies to the functions of those forms as well. For example, in the case of humans, it includes ideas and concepts and beliefs and visions and plans. Those are all functions of energy distribution. The energy is this tremendous energy that is coming from a source, and we and all things are kind of like, the power tools that we plug into the wall and then use that energy to transform it into some other form of energy to produce something or to result in some change. as a really brief side note, we're using electricity as an example here, electricity and light bulbs, and etc. But it's the same thing for natural forms of light, such as fire, because the energy, rather than coming down a wire, the energy has been stored inside these compounds, these organic compounds, like wood or methane. And once you break open one of those molecules with a spark or a flame or a match or whatever, it creates a chain reaction where the broken molecules release a whole bunch of their electrons. Those electrons, which are now free radicals, are banging into other molecules, releasing more electrons, and soon all the electrons are banging into each other, releasing more electrons, and that's what actually creates the distribution of energy, which we see in the form of fire, which is light, and the heat that comes from fire. Then after all of the energy is dissipated, the molecules and electrons, they all kind of recombine and settle down into much more lower energy compounds. For example, water or carbon dioxide or ash. These are compounds that don't have stored energy or have very little stored energy compared to the higher energy molecules like methane and oxygen. Those have a lot of energy in them. So when they meet, they become very reactive, and hence fire. This is the same as in the case of acids and alkalines. When you take hydrochloric acid, sodium hydroxide, and mix them together, there is this tremendous, super hot, explosive reaction, bubbling and steaming, and it's really quite a scene. And when everything settles down, you're left with essentially water and salt. That's it. Those reactions can also give off a lot of pretty colors. Back in the late 70s, before I was more ecologically conscious and responsible, myself and a few other people would go down to the beach in San Francisco and slingshot small chunks of cesium, sodium, and potassium into the Pacific Ocean. And they would generate beautiful explosions of yellow, red, and blue. It was really impressive, even if it was somewhat irresponsible and probably illegal. So the acids and the alkalines hold a lot of potential energy, and the potential energy in this case is the imbalance that they hold. Acids and alkalines are stable imbalances. And for our purposes, we can consider acids as that which rips away electrons from other compounds, and alkali is that which adds electrons to other compounds. That's not a technical explanation because acids and alkalines can get really complicated, but in general, that's the idea. So you've got something that is overly positively charged and something that is overly negatively charged. So the potential energy exists because of that imbalance. And because energy only moves in order to create balance, when you put these two things together, the energy will naturally move. So the process of a positive and negative electrical charge on a wire that lights up as a result of passing through a form of resistance is really the same thing as a positive or negative charge that's stored inside a compound like wood or methane and oxygen, because really all forms of matter, all molecules, are essentially like little batteries that store positive and negative charges. And the reaction of those two charges meeting is equivalent to the lighting of a light bulb. When these two charges react with each other in order to regain balance, which lowers their energy level, thereby releasing a bunch of energy, thereby distributing that released energy in the form of heat or light or whatever. It's the same process, the same formula, but in a different context. In both cases, it's the resistance of the material world that allows for that reaction and process of distribution to exist. The resistance of the tungsten, the resistance of the molecules in the compounds. In this material world, it is resistance that transforms energy into heat, light, work, force, etc. And because energy is awareness, those things, heat, force, light, work, are contextually limited expressions of awareness. And because consciousness is an instance of awareness, and energy is awareness, we can add consciousness to that list of transformations, along with heat, force, light, and work. There is also consciousness. But if consciousness is one of these transformative forces, like the way molecules or atoms emit photons, friction emits heat, electricity creates fields that can, move motors and do other kinds of things. What is the transformative function of consciousness? If consciousness is a contextual instance of awareness, and awareness is energy, then consciousness must be transforming some type of energy, but not the energy that we're typically used to dealing with, not the energy that moves motors or emits photons or creates heat. What is the transformative nature or quality or attributes of consciousness that can work on energy? Well, there may be many, but one of them certainly is self-awareness. Because with self-awareness, we have the ability to know that we know something, to be aware that we're aware of something, to maintain coherent thought, which is where our version of rationality or logic or reasoning comes into play, as this is how we develop understanding and knowledge that's relevant to us. In the past, other cultures have had different forms of coherent thought that we might consider irrational. But for them, it was rational because they had the ability to have coherent thought that was compatible with their context. In fact, I would say that self-awareness and coherent thought are two of the brightest transformations of this other type of energy that exists in the material world. And with the abilities of self-awareness and coherent thought, we are able to optimize or improve existing distributions of energy and create new ones for not only material energy, but the non-material energy. I really have to come up with a name for that. A perfect example of that was farming. You take a look at a farm from the earliest days of farming compared to a farm of today. The farm of today can distribute significantly more energy in the form of food than anything in the past. But it requires a tremendous amount of planning and thinking and reasoning and research and technology and a number of other things that can only exist as a result of reasoning and logic, which is the result of self-awareness, which is a function of energy distribution, the purpose of which is to distribute a higher form of energy. Once we became self-aware, we gained access to a new form of energy, which was referred to earlier, that does not manifest physically on its own. It's a form of energy that is not the energy that technology and science typically is aware of, although there is some indication that science is becoming aware of it, because there's quite a bit of discussion about the role of consciousness in the instantiation of matter, reality, at least on the quantum level, and maybe on a broader level. But as consciousness is an instance of awareness, and awareness is energy, that would make perfect sense. Attempting to understand and channel, instantiate that energy is what has led to beliefs, art, rituals, at least prior to the modern age, of which all of those things still exist, but now there's a lot more focus on it from a more scientific and very materialistic perspective. But what we want to look at when we're thinking about, okay, how are we transforming this other form of energy into our reality, we want to think about, how is this dispersing energy? How is this distributing energy? Because that is the point of it. We're talking about a new energy through which the dispersion of requires consciousness or self-awareness, as that idea is traditionally understood. And for us who are living in the physical world, the basic requirement is that we do something physical in order to instantiate that energy, whether it's cave drawings or sculptures or art or rituals around belief systems. All of these are just physical instances of this higher energy manifesting itself or distributing itself within the physical world through our consciousness. So the key point there is it requires some physical activity to close the circuit, so to speak, to ground it, to make it real. It has to have some sort of physical, material representation or instantiation. And it's the Thelema claim that it is this instantiation, this ordering of a higher form of energy, that is greatly responsible for the order of evolution, why things evolve the way they do. Similar to the morphic field concept, right, of Rupert Sheldrake, where there is this field of order that informs an organism how it will evolve. Why one stem cell chooses to become a liver cell and another one chooses to become a brain cell, for example. I'm referring to this as a thelonic intelligence, which is very similar to a morphic field, except it's considered a form of active intelligence because it is solving a problem, therefore it is a form of intelligence. And as intelligence is the interaction between two instances of awareness, it therefore implies consciousness. And this intelligence takes the form of patterns that instantiate differently depending on the limitations of the context it is instantiating within. So there's an archetypal pattern, and then there are the instances of that pattern which are altered according to context. These archetypal patterns represent the ideal distribution of energy. But being archetypes, they're not subject to the resistance that we experience in this material world. Sheldrake, in his work on morphic fields, has collected quite a bit of evidence showing that how things evolve and grow can't be explained simply by the genetic code, even though the genetic code itself is an instantiation of that higher form of energy, because it creates a more efficient organism for the distribution of this higher energy, not for the distribution of heat and fire, for example, or light, because that's only done on the material level. On the non-material level, it is what is the qualities of that energy that's being distributed in the form of self-awareness, coherent thought, reasoning, rationality, understanding, and knowledge. And for the record, belief, faith are forms of coherent thought. So belief and faith are also part of that transformative expression, at least according to the Thelonic model as it currently stands. And that's why systems have become more and more and more sophisticated to the point where it's being able to create a brain and a nervous system that is unbelievably complex and sophisticated against all odds to get to the point where we are now. And while that point is yet just another point along the path of our evolution, this point is particularly significant right now where we are today, because we have come to the point where we understand enough about this process of the distribution of this form of energy. Of course, we don't refer to it in that manner, but that's what it is. And one of the tipping points or landmarks in the expression of this new form of energy that is being transformed through self-awareness has been, well, technology in general, but specifically the ability to compute. And that officially began in the 1940s when the first computer was built. It was called the ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Calculator. But that was an idea that actually can date all the way back to the first attempt to make a calculator, which was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German philosopher and mathematician of the 17th century, who attempted to do that. And since those days, the idea had been brewing until we actually were able to build one in 1943. A couple of years after that, the discovery of nuclear power became a reality. And all this happening under the shadow or umbrella of the new paradigms of quantum theory and relativity, which has its roots going back to the 1900s with Max Planck and Einstein. So the 40s was a huge shift in the paradigm of reality that we held at the time. And I don't think it was a coincidence that in 1938, just a few years prior to these wild discoveries that had already been in the mix for a little while, Albert Hofmann discovered / invented LSD, which had a huge impact on the cultural revolution that took place in the 60s and 70s and 80s, at the same time that the global brain of what we now call the internet, but was then called the ARPANET, began to spread across the planet like a fungus. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, because funguses are responsible for life as we know it. I mean, we even share some of the same DNA as funguses because we evolved from a fungus. The fungus, which was one of the earliest forms of complex life on the planet, is a model of how life expands and grows, which also makes it a model of how energy seeks balance by dispersing itself, and why the fungus and all life forms came into existence in the first place, because they were a dispersion of energy in energy's attempt to seek balance. And the internet is like the mycelium roots of a mind fungus that is going to create a new form of life. Of course, it could take 250 million years, which is how long it took for funguses to become what we have today, but the path seems quite clear. But this dramatic shift that began in the 20th century can be traced back further. We could just look at the work of Gottfried Leibniz or Isaac Newton, both of whom were quite preoccupied by what we would today call esoteric teachings. Leibniz attempted to create a divine mathematics just using ones and zeros, which is kind of interesting, seeing as though that's what we ended up with the computer world. And he got that idea, or that idea was supported, when he saw a German translation of the Chinese I Ching, which is the yin-yang, essentially binary 1-0 system of philosophy and divination, although it's really a Taoist philosophy concept. And that dates back, well, anywhere between 2,000 and 5,000 years, depending on what you consider the source. And Newton's alchemical work was so feared by the King of England because he thought that Newton was going to turn lead into gold any day now and completely destroy the British economy, that Newton had to do a lot of his alchemical work in secret. And we just recently discovered a lot of this because those alchemical writings of Newton were just recently discovered. And when you read some of those documents, which are all written in Latin, but also some of them have been translated, it was very clear Newton's ideas about reality would today be considered completely fringe and goofy and new agey and insane. And yet modern science and technology is essentially based on Newton's work. And really, if we go back even further, we see elements of it in the Far East. We see elements of it in the discourses of Pythagoras and Plato. And even further back, really, if we consider the philosophies of Abraham and Melchizedek, which dates back 6,000 years. And that's just in the Western culture. When we look at indigenous cultures, we see similar references to this other energy of reality, this other force beyond the material forces that we are consumed with today. And historically, that other force has typically been seen as something divine or supernatural or spiritual in some way. But we're beginning to understand that these are forces of nature, just ones that are less obvious than the ones that we're usually used to. It doesn't make them any less spiritual or divine, supernatural, or mystical. What it does is it raises our physical reality to a level of supernatural, divine, mystical, and spiritual. Because really the physical reality is no less amazing, miraculous, mystical, or spiritual than any other level of reality. We have arrived at a level of understanding and a perspective of understanding of reality that allows us to begin to quantify this other force. And just like the understanding of magnetism and electricity and gravity, once we quantify it, once we understand the mechanics of how it works, we don't consider it a divine or mystical force anymore. It becomes a utility, something that's just part of our lives, like a light bulb or an airplane. The point is that for thousands of years, this evolution, this metamorphosis has been taking place, and it's coming to a tipping point right now with the advent of artificial intelligence and the concept of global data, where we can actually know every single little piece of data between a tomato grown in Argentina, who grew it, on what farm, what fertilizers did they use, how much water did that tomato require, etc., and its journey through its life until it ends up on a plate in some restaurant in Paris. And even after that, we can track what happens to the garbage from that restaurant and where it goes and what it's contributing to, ecologically speaking. This kind of data, along with the ability to process that kind of data through computer technology and artificial intelligence, etc., is going to so radically change our understanding of reality and how things work. We can't even really imagine it at this point. I mean, we can imagine maybe what might be in 5 or 10 years, but 100 years, it would be like predicting what the weather's going to be like on Saturday afternoon in the year 2300. We're in the middle of an explosion it's going to be almost impossible to predict where this will end up. And most of our visions now about where this might end up is probably going to be very techno-based concepts. However, it's inevitable that the understanding that is going to be delivered because of the technology is going to change the way we actually think and understand and perceive. So the technology is more of a transformational step in how we understand reality. I think it's safe to say that at some point in the future, what we have learned or what we will learn because of technology will stay with us even if the technology goes away. And by stay with us, I don't mean we'll remember it in how we normally remember things. More like it will become part of the fabric of our species. It will change the morphic intelligence that our species exists within, that directs how we evolve. And not just the species, it will probably change the morphic intelligence of the entire planet. And the reason for that is the same reason why and how we or anything evolves. And that reason is because energy, which is awareness, always moves in the most efficient, conservative manner that it can. That's why wasps, crabs, and beetles all evolved from the same original anthropod, but in three contexts of air, land, and sea. So different limitations, different physical material forces that required adaptation on their part. We're now facing the same forces, but not physical. Non-physical forces, non-physical energies, which we have access to or are influenced by because of our ability to have self-awareness, to have concepts, to have understanding and knowledge. The emergence or the evolution of self-awareness is equivalent to the fish that crawled out of the swamp onto land. While the needs of the fish remained the same, which is to survive, the forces that they had to contend with were radically different. Now there was air and light and other sorts of predators and dirt that they had to crawl on. I mean, it was a completely different reality for them. And really, their old reality had very little to offer them in understanding the new reality. But the laws of that new reality were effectively the same as the laws of their old reality, just that the context was different. The emergence of self-awareness is like moving from a swamp onto the land. So when did self-awareness begin? Well, there's a bunch of different theories on that, and most of them are based around the evolution of the cortex, cerebral cortex, because apparently that's critical for having self-awareness. And the human brain began to become unique in its evolution about 6 or 7 million years ago. So there's a lot of room there. But one of the more compelling arguments, at least I think it's one of the more compelling arguments, and so do a number of other scientists and experts in the field, is the theory put forth by Julian Jaynes, who wrote the book, which was actually his theory as well, called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And this very radical theory suggests that human consciousness, as we currently understand it, only came into play about 3,000 years ago, which is when what he called the bicameral mind, which is when the two sides of the brains were much more connected to each other, began to become much more disconnected with each other, resulting in the need for things like laws, languages, which inevitably leads to things like mathematics and institutions, etc., societies, economies. And that date matches quite neatly with the concept of the one God who called itself I am what I am, which is pretty much the description of self-awareness in the vision that Moses had on the mountain somewhere around 3,500 years ago. So self-awareness may have had its seeds quite a long time ago, but the form that it exists in today, according to this theory, is relatively new. And 3,000 years in the span of evolution kind of puts us on the first day or two of crawling out of the swamp and onto the land. So we can expect to be dealing with these new forces, these new energies, these new types of awareness that we don't yet fully or even partially understand for quite some time. But we have managed to learn enough in the short time that we've had to deal with it to build tools, to build technology. And the Thelonic view is that technology is as natural a progression of evolution as was the anthropod to the wasp or the fish to the lizard. We're at a point in evolution right now where we are essentially being forced to distribute this new type of energy that we have become exposed to as a result of self-awareness while living in this physical, material world of resistance. Consequently, we are a new form of light. We can think of it that way. We're a new type of light bulb. Our resistance is transforming a different and new type of energy, at least new to us. And I suspect we're the only other, or at least only one of a few species on this planet that can support this type of transformation of energy. So how can we facilitate this transformation? I'm not sure, but the first step, I would imagine, is to become aware of the reality that everything is awareness. If energy is awareness and everything is energy, then everything is awareness. So by simply becoming aware of the existence of awareness, you are effectively becoming aware of everything. This is also a very similar concept to that of I am that I am, which were the words spoken by God to Moses at the burning bush. I am is the signature of self-awareness. I am that I am is the awareness of self-awareness. So, it's probably a good place to start. And that's that.